Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So before we get into tonight's story, I just want to talk about the short that I put up a few days ago. Um, so obviously with shorts, if you do your own content, you're aware you only get a minute time frame to talk about what you need to talk about. Um, just to elaborate further, so I'm not leaving YouTube. I'm not taking a break from YouTube. I'm just cutting down my content. The massive reason for that is with the new job that I have and also running the quiz nights, I'm not as available as I always was. And with that, I'm not really getting much time to myself. And because of that, it's just made me a little bit ill recently. And I realised that one thing had to give. Now, I don't want to give up the channel because, like I always say, you guys have really helped me out massively. But because of everything that's happened in the past year, I've not properly processed that. I've not properly dealt with it because I've just thrown myself into working and trying to keep my mind off it. So I've not dealt with everything. So it's just all come kind of bubbling up. So for the time being, True Crime Stories with Silhouette is going on to a fortnightly basis. Also with that as well, it means that I can put more time into my videos and actually deliver you much better content than what I have done. It won't always be like that. I aim to at some point get it back up to the weekly basis. But for now, I've got to prioritize my mind and my health. Um, I really hope you guys understand. Obviously, we always say mental health must come first, and it's absolutely true. So just a huge thank you to you all for listening to me ramble on for the past 3 minutes. And we are going to get into the tonight's story. So, in regards of tonight's story, it's not one that I particularly wanted to do originally, mainly because I didn't want to see it as an attack on religion. B, the story has been told about quite a lot over the past few months. It's been spoken about non-stop. Multiple channels have done their own versions of this story. One of the victims, he's spoken out numerous times about this story. But in the end, after studying parts of it, I felt it was just too good and too important of a story to not tell. And one of the biggest reasons for that is one of the victims in this story, she passed away a few weeks ago, or a couple of months, I think it was. And she's one of the ones that I don't think, apart from her book, she didn't really speak out that much. So it's about giving her a voice as well. And this story also, it affected a lot more than the three people that we are going to be focusing on. There was so many other people that it did affect, and I just really wanted to put some time and effort into this. And like I said, I got express permission to go ahead and do this video. So just a massive thank you to Christopher for allowing this. And let's get on with tonight's true crime case. So tonight's case, we're going to be talking about the crimes of Eunice Spry. Now, I don't know what other people have found out about her because I haven't watched their videos. I couldn't find much about her background. All I know is that she was born on the 28th of April 1944. She was born in Gloucestershire, and obviously you're looking at the time frame of when she was born. Already she was born into incredibly tough circumstances. She was born coming up to the end of World War Two. And at some point in her life, her parents may have already been involved, but at some point she becomes Jehovah's Witness. Now, I put a lot of study in recently into the Jehovah's Witness. Obviously, I've known about Jehovah's Witnesses all my life. I just didn't really understand a lot of what went on within that organisation. And so for the past couple of months, I've been studying, and it's opened my eyes up to what actually goes on. And it's caused a lot of misery to a lot of people, this religion. This is from testimonies of ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTubers that are on here. You can watch them. And there's also a documentary that was released a few years ago with people who used to be in the organisation as well, speaking out about what goes on behind closed doors. So when I say about a lot of misery, it's words from their mouths. If you're not 100% sure what a Jehovah's Witness is or what they believe, so it's basically a secular sort of sector of Christianity. So Jehovah's have their own secular beliefs. Their first one is that God's name is actually Jehovah, and they are his witnesses. And they believe that by calling him Jehovah, they have a closer relationship to God. The biggest one that they're known for is not celebrating birthdays or Christmas, mainly because they believe it's a pagan holiday. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses have taken parts of the Bible and changed it to suit their narrative. And sorry as well if you see me rubbing my nose. I'm got a little bit of a cold at the moment. Now, so what I was saying, so it's a subdivision of Christianity. So Jehovah's Witnesses have taken parts of the Bible and changed parts of the story. So they don't believe that Jesus was born Christmas Day. They believe he was born in the summer, which is quite a common thing. That's not particularly a Jehovah's Witness thing, but this one of the big reasons why they don't celebrate Christmas, because Christmas and birthdays are seen as a pagan thing. Obviously, we all know about the blood transfusion thing. We're going to get into that a little bit later. And all of their rules, all of their rulings, I'm going to be dropping in little things here and there about other belief systems. I'm just telling you a very black and white version of it at the moment. One of their biggest belief systems is the two witness rule, which again we're going to go into a little bit later. So we're just going to get back into the story. So eventually in her adult life, Eunice, she marries a man named Mike, and they go on to have two biological daughters. That's Judith and Becky. Now, after the marriage eventually ended, which is another thing that Jehovah's Witnesses do not agree with. They do not agree with divorce whatsoever. No matter what happens within that marriage, they have to stay within that marriage. Very, very frowned upon for people to leave the marriage. So, with the ending of her marriage, Eunice, she kept really good contact and formed a really close bond with her oldest daughter, Judith. But her younger daughter, Becky, or Rebecca, she ended up leaving home at the age of 18 and maintained extremely minimal contact with Eunice. Now, one of the big things, another really big thing with Jehovah's Witnesses is the act of shunning. So someone who walks away from the religion for whatever reason, and it could literally be down to them masturbating, because Jehovah's Witnesses don't agree with that. They class it as self-abuse. and they were going to have a meeting with three of the elders, and the elders are always men, and this can happen from a young teenager going in for these meetings, sitting in front of three men and asked extremely personal, embarrassing questions about their bodies, and it's then decided if they're sorry enough or not, and if they are deemed sorry, they can stay within the organisation. If they're not deemed sorry enough, then they're asked to leave. And this is what I believe happened to Becky. Now, once someone is disfellowshipped, Jehovah's Witnesses will then shun that person. And what they usually do is the family will pretend that that person has died, because it's shameful to no longer be a Jehovah's Witness. In the late 1970s, Eunice filed paperwork to allow her to become a childminder. This paperwork eventually was turned down. One of the biggest reasons for this was because of her faith. Because of obviously the rumours around at the time of many churches and many organisations with the cover up of child abuse. And Jehovah's Witness parents, again, this is from ex-Jehovah's Witness members, they don't believe in not sparing the rods. Like, they are known for hitting their children. It wouldn't be uncommon to go to a Kingdom Hall and there'd be a child fidgeting in the seat. In fact, there's one story that we'll share with you guys. And again, this is from the mouths of a Jehovah's Witness, or ex-Jehovah's Witness, sorry. So they said that they were in the Kingdom Hall, and in front of their seat was a little girl, and the man next to her was inappropriately touching her, and because the child was fidgeting, the child was no older than about 5, 6, because that child was fidgeting in their seat and not looking up and looking at the elders, the mother dragged the child out and hit the child, pulled it back in and sat on the chair. Now, with this decision of not allowing her to become a childminder, this eventually was reversed, and eventually she begins a career in childminding. She then applies to be a foster parent in 1983, and for a while this was turned down. She then had the decision reversed, and she fosters a little baby girl called Charlotte. And this was in 1984, and she later formally and legally adopts Charlotte. In 1986, Eunice fosters and later adopts another child who she calls Victoria. Now, Victoria was the name that Eunice had given the child, as she felt that the child's real name was too inappropriate and to do with the devil. Now, Victoria's background also hasn't really been discussed. What I do know is that she and her older brother were adopted out to another family, and her biological parents later on had 2 other brothers who remained with that family. Now, one of these brothers, his name was Daniel, or is Daniel, sorry. He's also spoken out about certain things. Eunice tried to foster and adopt Daniel, but this was eventually stopped by the family. So at this particular point of Eunice coming into contact with Victoria, Victoria was 3 years old. And as she was a little bit older, Eunice was convinced that this child had the devil inside her. And Victoria said at one time she had taken labels off some tins that Eunice had been buying. As all children do, they don't understand, you leave something lying out on the floor, they're going to pick it up. If it's got a label in it, they're going to rip it off. They're going to draw on something. You know, the child's not going to sit there and do your taxes. They get up to mischief. They don't understand. Eunice, she then ties Victoria down to a high chair, and she puts a can in front of her, and she tells the 3-year-old that whatever's in that can, she has to eat. Now, this was from either soup, beans, dog food, or cat food. And Victoria was force-fed cat food. At the age of 4, Victoria was forced to wear a sign around her neck, so when Eunice would take her to the Kingdom Hall. So in the Kingdom Hall, you're expected to go around twice a week. But you're also expected to put in around 70 hours unpaid work of canvassing and witnessing. And if you don't do that, you're seen as blood guilty. And what I mean by that is, so Jehovah's Witnesses have a firm belief that one day God is gonna, or Jehovah is gonna have enough of the evil that goes on in this world, and he's gonna bring about Armageddon. Now, Armageddon has been spoken about 3 times and predicted 3 times. The last time was in 1975. This basically means that anyone who's not a Jehovah's Witness will die. There you go, big clouds of fire are going to come down from the sky, wipe every non-Jehovah Witness off the earth. Jehovah's are going to take over. They're going to live in eternal youth in a place called Paradise, and they're going to live with just other Jehovah's Witnesses and all the animals in the world, and no one's ever going to die, no, apart from anyone who's not a Jehovah's Witness, except 144,000 of them who have been selected to live with Jehovah in heaven. And this is what they fully teach their children. This is what they fully teach their adults. This is what, when they knock on your door, but they used to, it's not something that really gets done anymore, but when they used to go around door knocking, that's what they were trying to convince you, me, everyone else what's going to happen. So it was kind of like a fear-mongering thing for more people to join the organisation. So, like I said, Eunice takes Victoria to a Kingdom Hall. She's forced to wear a sign around her neck, and this says that this child is evil. She wets the bed. Do not speak to her. She's an attention seeker. And obviously, a 4-year-old isn't going to have any idea what's going on. And if she's wetting the bed, there's a perfectly good reason for it. It's because we know that Eunice was physically abusing this little girl at 4 years old, at 3 years old. That's the reason, because there's a fear. She knows at some point she's going to get punished for something really, really minor. And this is what's creating that fear. And naturally, she's going to wet the bed. And it's just a vicious cycle. And one that, unfortunately, never healed for a very, very long time. Eventually in 1992, Eunice fosters 2 more children. That was 6-year-old Aloma and 4-year-old Christopher. Now, Christopher and Aloma, they were biological siblings. And later on, they're joined by their brother Caleb, who was still a baby at the point. So as soon as paperwork was signed, Aloma and Christopher beforehand treated like any other child. You know, there was not really a real love there because obviously they weren't Eunice's children. But as soon as the paperwork was signed, they were given the exact same treatment as Victoria. Charlotte and Caleb, however, they were separated and treated like royalty. basically. Especially Charlotte. She got whatever she wanted. She had the biggest room in the house. She was treated like a little queen. Caleb was a different sort of case. He was treated like a baby throughout his life. So by the time it came out with what actually happened, the police began investigating. Caleb was around 12 years old and he wasn't able to function as a 12-year-old. He didn't know how to tie his laces. He didn't know how to clean himself up properly after going to the toilet. And that was because Eunice did everything for him and she would get the other children to do those things for him. She never allowed him to grow up. We now can obviously see that as incredibly abusive, but when you're a 6-year-old, 4-year-old, 7-year-old child and you're watching this, you don't really compute that this is abuse. You're just thinking, why am I not getting that treatment? It would have been incredibly difficult for the kids. Now, all the kids, so Victoria, Loma and Christopher, they all said that Eunice was incredibly obsessed with checking food in the cupboards. She would leave markers on everything, and if she felt that something was stolen, woe betide them. On one occasion, Eunice felt that a Bounty chocolate bar had been stolen from the kitchen. So she goes out to where the children are at that particular point. She orders them in the house and they're told to go up to Charlotte's room. They're made to stand in a semicircle. They're interrogated by Eunice about this missing chocolate. Now, each of the children, they deny that they took it. They deny they know what's happened. And Eunice, she walks over to the other side of the room. She picks up a chair leg. She asks them again, where is the chocolate? They deny it. They don't know what's happened. And one by one, she begins whacking the chair leg on top of the children's feet. Obviously, each time it's happening, the child would fall down crying. Eunice would force them to get back up. The only one who stood defiant was Victoria. She refused to fall. She refused to give in. And it was said that eventually it turned out all three of them were telling the truth. No one had taken the chocolate bar. In fact, one of the dogs had got hold of it and they found the wrapper a few weeks later in the garden. Another occasion, a single chicken nugget had gone missing. Victoria, this time, she got the blame. She was tied to a chair naked and blindfolded. At one point, she's wet herself because she's got nowhere else to go. Eunice unties her and forces Victoria to lick up the urine off the floor like a dog. And every time Victoria was retching, she was being sick, Eunice would just say to her, you're weak-minded, so this is mind over matter, what is wrong with you, blah, blah. When Christopher and Loma, they were assaulted and subjected to the same treatment, Eunice would tell them that it was to save them from Armageddon that was coming. She would deny them sleep by making them walk up and down stairs for hours on end. If one of them stopped, the others had to wake Eunice up so she could punish them. She would make them do the invisible chair trick. And this is just basically, it's what you see some people in the gym doing nowadays, but it originally was used as a torture technique in World War II Japan, and this is what the Japanese used to do to the Chinese, where they would assume a seated position with no chair and be forced to hold this for hours until they collapsed. Christopher said that in Eunice's room, in this particular house, there was a small sort of hallway like a box hallway between the long corridor and Eunice's room. The children were made to stand in that little box hallway and watch Eunice sleep. And if one of them fell asleep, what she had was a series of alarms. And if she woke up and one of them were asleep, they would be punished. Around the same time, Eunice, she was volunteering to work in a end-of-life hospice, and she was volunteering as a nurse. So she grew a deep understanding of which parts of the body were able to bruise, which parts that she could hit and not be found out about. And she figured out that if she hit the children on the soles of their feet, no one was going to see that. And this is another thing that she would do. She would get the children to lay on their backs, feet up in the air, and she would whip the soles of their feet with bamboo canes. However, there were times that she did leave marks, children being bruised. So at some point, the kids are put into a education system. They go to school. Teachers start noticing pretty quickly some real alarming behaviours going on with them. And Christopher, at one point, he's seen stealing from other children's lunchboxes because he's being denied food, and the food that he is given is incredibly bland. You know, a couple of slices of bread, a glass of water, those sort of things. And, you know, here are these children with chocolate spread sandwiches and packets of crisps, Coke. Probably at the time, we were looking at this time frame in the 1990s, probably Panda Pops. I don't know if you guys remember them. I remember my very first school, there was a massive kick-off because they took away Panda Pops because of the sugar content. But I remember those being served at my school. So, you know, he was seen stealing all of this, and on closer inspection, they could see that the three of them, so Victoria, Aloma, and Christopher, had bruises and whatnot. And this was quickly made note of. When it was brought to Eunice's attention, surprise, surprise, miraculously, the children are pulled out of school, and the school are told that they're now going to have a home education. Now, because of the school's dealing with Eunice, they did call the social services, and when they went round the social services, they literally just done a doorstop visit because they were actually very, very afraid of Eunice. She had a lot of power within that town. In fact, there were actual other Jehovah's Witnesses who were scared of Eunice. Now, which is very, very rare within that community because they don't really allow or like women to be seen as stronger than men. So, in a traditional sort of sense, within the Jehovah's Witness community, men are seen as the head of the house. It's only the men that go in to become elders. They go into the governing body. If you're not sure what the governing body is, it's a group of 8 men who live in an upscale massive house in New York. They call this house Bethel. And these 8 men, they're the ones that set all the rules. So, for example, if Stephen Lett, one of them's called, repugnant, repulsive looking thing, if he was to say that I could join, dress like this, but obviously physically and looks wise, I am a man, but I choose to do drag. If he decided that I could go in and start preaching, dress like this, every other Jehovah's Witness on this planet would have to accept that. If they allowed gay members into there, if they allowed women in general, if they allowed a woman to join their brethren, and women were allowed to be seen as the head of house, every other Jehovah's Witness on this planet would have to follow suit. But because he doesn't, they are all very much stuck in their ways. It was at a point that men weren't allowed to have beards, they had to be suited and booted, women weren't allowed to wear trousers. Incredibly strict. And this all comes from the governing body. So it's very rare for any Jehovah's Witness to be fearful of a female. But Eunice was seen like this. She was seen as very difficult. It was a difficult case because she was Jehovah's Witness. Now, eventually, social services leave her alone. The abuse continues for hours and hours a day. You know, these children are forced to walk up and down stairs and do incredibly degrading things for hours. At one point, Eunice begins pushing knives into their throats. She's twisting them, so they're damaged and cut inside of their throats. There was chair legs that were forced into the children's mouths. And in fact, they found that when the police began investigating this story, they found that particular chair leg with the children's teeth marks still ingrained into the wood. The house that Eunice lived in, it was seen as an absolute shit tip. Like, she had no care or consideration. The only room that was kind of kept pristine was Charlotte's room. You know, there are other things as well. If Charlotte wanted something, she would get it within that. In Gloucester, they have a yearly annual fair, and one particular day, because Charlotte wanted to go and do all the rides, she's taken, but it naturally meant that Aloma, Christopher, and Victoria had to go with her, but they all had to watch as Charlotte is spinning around on these rides. She's getting candy floss, she's getting popcorn, she's allowed to watch the fireworks while they've got to stand there, shiver, and watch as she's going around. So incredibly sick. Other times, Eunice would force them to watch horror films, and she would sit there and watch their reactions to films like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. Bearing in mind, obviously, we're talking about the 1990s, so these films were still incredibly popular. And we can look at them now and think, you know, whatever. Like, me personally, I'm a massive fan of those films. I have been since I was younger, but to a really young child, it can be quite unsettling, you know, seeing Freddy Krueger run down the alleyway with his arm, like, so, you know, talking about a child who's barely, not even 10, and they're being forced to watch these kind of films. And, you know, they've got the foster mother sitting next to them, watching their reaction to this. Actually, in 1996, Eunice, she comes into contact with a real seriously ill man named John. And John owned a humongous farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of Tewkesbury. And she starts going to this house to take care of him. It's believed that John had cancer. He was on he had to sleep with an oxygen mask on. And this was every single day, which we're going to come back to in a minute. She's taking Charlotte with her originally, and John becomes absolutely enamoured with Charlotte, because here's this girl who's, you know, classically musically trained. She can do tap dance, she can play instruments, you know, she's seen as the model child, the absolute epiphany of what every child should aspire to be, and what every parent wants their child to aspire to be. And because John never had any children of his own, he becomes absolutely enamoured of her in a sort of, it was described as almost grandfather-granddaughter sort of thing without a blood connection. He's eventually introduced to Chris, Aloma and Victoria, and Eunice just says that, oh, you won't see much of them because they're really naughty. Now, John lived in, like I said, on the outskirts of Tewkesbury, and in a place called Eckington in Worcestershire. He had no family apart from an older brother, and like I said, John required at the time an oxygen mask to stay alive. Eventually, because of the closeness he felt to Charlotte, John, for some reason, signed over the farmhouse into Charlotte's name. And because of her age at the time, Eunice is given power of attorney. Now, not long after the signing of this will, John mysteriously dies. It was deemed accidental as he had slept that night with no oxygen mask on. And this is a man who done the same thing every single fucking night. You know, he knew how to, he could do it himself. And then one particular night he goes to bed without turning the oxygen mask on and he dies. It's believed that Eunice had something to do with this, but it can never be proven. The night that he dies, or as he lays dying, Eunice takes the children up to the room. The room's set in darkness. The only light coming through is from moonlight. And she stands the children at the foot of the bed and she forces them to look at John's dead body as he's just laying there. They stand there and are forced to watch him for about half an hour. And eventually she leaves him out. Not long after, Eunice moves the family into the farmhouse and begins to live in there full time. And she tells that Aloma, Victoria and Christopher that they would have to go out and sleep in the barns and the mobile home that was dumped in the grounds. And she just completely starves them of any food at this point. To survive, they had to eat chicken pellets. And again, this was something that Eunice kept control of. She knew exactly what was in there. So she goes out, she's looking at his bag, she's realising some chicken pellets are missing. She forces them to put their fingers down their throat, throw pellets up, and then she would force them to eat their own vomit. She would force them to eat their own feces. Like I said, she would push sticks and knives into their throats, sometimes a chair leg. And Aloma said that she would pull it down the backs of our throats and thrust. She would twist it so it cut the back of our throat. It was excruciating, but I learned to switch it off. I'd concentrate on the crack in the ceiling. I would take my mind to a different place and just wait for it to be over with. On some occasions, Eunice, she would use sandpaper as a cleaning cloth and she would rub their faces red raw. One particular occasion, I'm not 100% sure for the reasoning behind it, but Eunice ties Christopher to the back of her van. She begins driving at full speed around the grounds. Christopher is knocked off his feet. He's being dragged behind his van. Again, barely 10 years old. And he's knocked unconscious due to his skull having a contact with the earth. And he's eventually brought around by Aloma and Victoria. And the three of them would tend to each other's injuries and, make their own splints. clean each other's cuts, clean each other's wounds, just generally take care of each other. And in 1999, the kids get the chance of a lifetime, and Eunice and the whole family end up going away on this once in a lifetime holiday. When I say whole family, it included Eunice's parents. There was Mike, her ex-husband, Judith, there was Charlotte, Caleb, Victoria, Aloma, Christopher, and Eunice herself. She takes them all on the shopping spree. They all get completely matching outfits. So that's another thing that Eunice was into. She loved the children to look matchy-matchy. There's quite a well-known image of them all within the Kingdom Hall. And she would, for example, buy for this holiday a pair of white jeans, and then there was a different colour shirt for every day. So on one day they wear red, one day wear green, one day wear yellow. And Eunice was said to have been quite a well-known, really good seamstress, and she would craft these little Kingdom Hall outfits by herself. So, like I said, all these people, they go to Florida for around 6 or 7 weeks, and it's not known where the money came from for this holiday. You know, staying in America for 6 or 7 weeks, going to Disneyland, swimming with dolphins, getting hire cars, having 2 different places that you're staying in, that was not a cheap thing. You know, they ended up flying business class. And Christopher said that this was the only genuine time that Eunice was like a mother. You know, there was no abuse for their whole entire 7 weeks. There was no raised voice. They were getting hugs, kisses, proper food. And he said that because obviously being denied proper food for so long, his body wasn't used to it, and he ended up shitting himself on the plane. And Eunice wasn't even angry. She lovingly dealt with it. Eventually, the 7 weeks of bliss, it comes to an end. Now, obviously, there's certain parts of the holiday that I haven't mentioned. And it's mainly because Christopher hasn't spoke about himself. What I will say is he believes that there's something that went on, because there's parts of the holiday he has no recollection of whatsoever, but he doesn't want to go into it. And I'm respecting his wishes. I'm not going to mention some of the bits that he's very briefly spoke about, but we'll leave it at that. So, eventually after this 7 weeks of bliss, they return home, and immediately Eunice switches. They step in through the front door, and it's quite evidently clear that somehow the immersion boiler has been left on for that whole entire time. It's overfilled, and it's caused not substantial, like quite a small amount of damage. But Eunice flies into a rage, and they are all punished for this. Eventually, she results in shock tactics with them. Now, you know, she would swing up and hit them while they were sleeping. She would attempt to drown them in the bath, because the farmhouse had a very old-fashioned roll-top style bath. She would hold them under the water with this, and she would call this their baptism. Now, this is really common within the Jehovah's Witness community, is baptisms, and this is performed at the Kingdom Hall. Now, in regards to the Kingdom Hall, these are built by Jehovah's Witness men, because another thing that's not really widely discussed, and one thing that probably surprised you, Jehovah's Witnesses don't like their children to go into further education. Their reasoning for that is who is going to need a doctor when it comes to Armageddon? who so they would rather their children go into carpentry, building works, roofing, painting and decorating, because the men are the ones that build the kingdom halls, and with that the men are expected to give 20% of their wage to the kingdom hall. This is all while obviously the women are either at work or they're the ones that have to do 70 hours a month unpaid labour to go out and spread the good word. So in the middle of the kingdom halls under the stage is a swimming pool, and this is where obviously the baptisms happen. So Eunice holding them down under the water for a lot longer than what is necessarily needed. This was her way of baptising them and trying to release demons out of them, so she said. Now, Christopher said that a lot of times there's certain things that he has no recollection of, especially obviously with the Florida holiday, but also just in general because Eunice was hell-bent on proving that the children had ADHD. She was going to various different doctors, private doctors, and she was claiming around 5 to 6 different prescriptions each child. And this meant that when it come to dosing them with Ritalin, because Ritalin is within the same family as speed, obviously taken in its prescribed dosage really helps. When you're giving a child 9 times that amount, they are high as a kite, because we all know what speed does, and the child is bouncing around everywhere. They're high as a kite, but when it comes to the come down, they have no recollection of it. In the summer of 2000, so around a year after the Florida trip, the family take a trip to a Pontins holiday park in Brigham. And this was because Eunice had friends that had just been there. So she's gone down. They've decided to obviously her friends gone down there, sorry. Eunice decided to follow suit. So she takes all the children down there. Judith has gone with her. And at this particular time, something I haven't mentioned was that Judith was also compliant within the abuse. You know, there were periods of time that she was living with Eunice as well, and she was either holding the children down or standing on their necks, and she was aware of what was going on. I think this is probably one of the biggest beliefs is why the second daughter, Rebecca, left, and her and Eunice just cut each other off. It was because Eunice is probably doing the exact same thing to her biological children, because, like I said, many Jehovah's Witnesses families, they believe in not sparing the rod. So, on the way back from this little holiday, the family get caught up in a traffic jam. So this is on September the 18th, 2000. So they get caught up in this traffic jam, and eventually, around 3 or 4 hours later, they arrive home. Eunice, she's in a panic. She's trying to call Judith. There's no answer. So in one car was Eunice, Christopher, Aloma, and in the other car would have been Judith, Charlotte, Victoria, and Caleb. So she can't get hold of her children. So this is where eventually police, they turn up at the house. Quite a number of hours later, they knock on the door, and Eunice ends up going away with them. So obviously Christopher and Aloma, they're like, what is going on? Like, what's happened? And Eunice just coldly walks out the door and gets in the police car. They drive off. Eventually, Christopher and Aloma, they end up being taken to the hospital. And it soon transpires that because of this traffic bounce, so Judith got caught up. So Judith was one who was driving. She was in her early 30s at this time. She's got caught up in a traffic jam in Avonmouth, and in front of her was a lorry, and coming up behind her at 50 miles an hour was another lorry. And the driver of the second lorry wasn't aware. He wasn't paying attention. He was changing something at the top of his radio station, and he collides with the back of Judith's car. And the force of this, it sends the car into the lorry in front. And the car gets sandwiched between these two lorries. And this results in both Judith and Charlotte, they die within impact. They are decapitated, they squashed. In fact, it's said that Victoria, who was in the back seat at the time, she's woken up to find Judith and Charlotte's heads in her lap. As for Charlotte, she ends up in incredibly critical condition. Like, it's a miracle that she survived it. She ends up having to have her stomach in a bag. She's told she might not never walk again. Incredibly bad. She's losing pint after pint after pint of blood. She's eventually airlifted to hospital. Caleb, he's also in the car. Luckily, he's in a booster seat at this time. Bearing in mind, obviously, he's coming up to 10 years old. He's still in a booster seat because he's been pampered and babied his whole life. The only part of his body that was affected were his legs. His legs were crushed and broken in several places. Luckily, he had no lasting effects from this. He's able to run around and whatnot. Him and Christopher's spoken about this. Him and Caleb have kept a close bond as brothers. He said that obviously the scarring is unbelievable, but Caleb is able to just run around and do whatever. Now, obviously Victoria, she's put on life support due to the blood loss, and it then comes to a decision on blood transfusion. Again, something Jehovah's Witnesses vehemently refuse. And we're going to get into why. So obviously, naturally, Eunice flat refuses. She says no. The doctors, and it's very rare for this to happen, but the doctors actually override her. And something gets lost in translation in regards to the paperwork, but the blood transfusion ends up going ahead and it saves Victoria's life. For this, Eunice, she is livid, and she ends up talking to Aloma and Christopher. She goes into the waiting room. They're like, what's happened? Like, what is going on? And she just coldly tells them, there's been a car crash. Judith and Charlotte are dead, and I wish it was you. So Victoria, she ends up spending the next 6 months in intensive care, and she's told that, obviously, like I said, she's going to need physiotherapy. There's a chance she might not ever walk again. Eunice sees this as a money-making opportunity. When eventually Victoria, she's brought around from intensive care, Eunice tells her spitefully that she can't walk, she's paralysed from the waist down. There's no point in her even attempting to do the physiotherapy. And eventually Victoria's allowed home. She's confined to a wheelchair. If she made any attempts at this time to try and walk, Eunice would pull away the foot plates of the wheelchair and hit Victoria with them. So for the next couple of years, Aloma, Chris and Victoria, obviously they're now teenagers. They are getting stronger, which means Eunice was now fast approaching her 60s. She's getting a little bit weaker, a little bit slower. Chris recalls one day Eunice attempting to hit him with a hammer, and he literally just grabbed it and pushed it away. And this is when Eunice would result into more shock tactics. You know, she would run up behind while they weren't expecting it and hit them with a cricket bat. She would throw water over them and they were asleep, or hit them while they were asleep. If they were walking. So in the farmhouse was a massive sort of really old-fashioned oven. And on the oven was a metal plate, which obviously we all know that metal conducts a lot of heat. And while they were walking past this, Eunice would grab their arm and push their hand down onto it as a shock tactic. Now, eventually, Eunice, she removes Aloma from the home and she gives Aloma £100, takes her to Bristol and leaves her there, and Aloma ends up just obviously never going back. She then tells Christopher that he has to go look after her parents because they are now obviously in their, I would say mid-80s, maybe early 90s at this point, and her father is incredibly disabled and he needs a lot of looking after. So Christopher agrees to this because he's now at a point that he's actually being fed proper food. You know, again, obviously her parents weren't the greatest, but I think we can all agree an alley cat would probably make a better mother than Eunice. I think it's probably one of my cat's turds would make a better mother than Eunice. So this just leaves behind Victoria and Caleb. Victoria, she's still confined to her wheelchair and she's still being subjected to horrific abuse by Eunice. In late 2004, Caleb decides that he wants to start going back to the Jehovah's Witness meetings. So obviously they meet twice a week, as well as obviously the Sunday service. Now, Eunice agrees on this. So she doesn't want to go to the meetings. She goes to a Sunday service, but she doesn't want to go to the midweek meetings. But she agrees that Caleb can go because he still has a friend that goes there and he wants to go hang out with his friend. This is another thing as well with Jehovah's Witness children, is that they are discouraged from socialising with any outside world influences. They're not allowed to have friends that are not Jehovah's Witness. So it's incredibly isolating religion to bring your children up in. So obviously naturally he's going to want to go see the only person that will actually play with him. So Victoria has to take him along. At this particular point, Victoria was still being abused. You know, her face was red raw. You can see in the police photo the amount of open sores on her face, and that was due to Eunice rubbing her skin with sandpaper. Then walks this girl in a wheelchair. She's covered in scars. Her face just torn apart. Confined to this wheelchair that she doesn't even need to be in. Like, little spoiler alert there, but she doesn't need to be in this wheelchair. The Jehovah's Witness community are shocked. Now, don't get me wrong, everything I've told you about the Jehovah's Witness community so far, it's not an attack on them, because it's only a very small minority that are truly evil. A lot of them can be decent people. Don't get me wrong, it's just literally they are so blindsided and believe everything that they get told by the governing body. And I believe if the governing body, like I said, told them to jump off a mountain, they would go do it. Like, that's how brainwashed these people are. But at the same time, they are incredibly caring people, majority of the time. So, they are absolutely appalled at the state of Victoria. They can't believe what they're seeing. And they are pressurising her to say what's going on. They know something's going on. Eventually, Victoria, she breaks down and she tells them very, very little. But this is enough for them. And eventually, later on that same day, due to the very little information that Victoria's told them, they create a safe house. This is just before Christmas time, 2004. Bear in mind, obviously, they don't celebrate Christmas. But they create a safe house situation for Victoria. Bearing in mind, obviously, this is against their church regulations because of the whole two-witness rule. Now, what that is there's been a lot of, over the years, there's been a lot of abuse stories that have come up. So it'd be child abuse, domestic abuse, verbal abuse, sexual, everything. A lot of it got covered up because abuse doesn't happen out in the open. It's always kept as a secret between the victim and the perpetrator. They're not going to openly do it in front of someone who could easily go to the police. But Jehovah's Witnesses, they have this thing called the two-witness rule, which basically means there needs to be two witnesses that have seen this abuse before anything can be done about it. So the elders of this community, particular Jehovah's Witness community, they're saying to these people, there's something we can do about it. You can't get involved. You need to leave it be. And they're like, absolutely not. We cannot ignore this. And they go above and beyond. And eventually, because of this, they are actually reprimanded by the elders for going against their wishes. So this naturally means that the police end up being involved, which again, Jehovah's Witnesses do not do. Police come down, they speak to Victoria, they know what's going on, and eventually this culminates in Eunice finally being arrested. And a few days later, with the truckload of evidence, the photos they've got of Victoria's abuse, because of her injuries, and it weren't just fresh injuries, we're talking about over a decade worth of injuries now. They actually had to send her to a coroner. Same as Christopher, same as Aloma, all three of them had to go to a coroner because of the history of abuse. And this resulted in around a van's worth of paper being used to build up this case. So obviously, like I said, Eunice, she's arrested. Quite quickly, she's denying it. She's saying that Victoria's made all this up. Police are not fools. They know what is going on. But Eunice, she's sticking to her story. Victoria's made all of this up. So eventually they decide that they need to speak to Aloma and Christopher. So they drive very early hours in the morning. They pick up Caleb. They drive to Eunice's parents' house and they knock on the door, and Christopher comes downstairs. They notice his appearance as well. Bear in mind, obviously, it's been a good few months that he's eventually been able to get out away from Eunice, but the signs are there. And he's in incredibly old-fashioned clothing because he's never been bought a stitch of clothing since Florida, which was 5-6 years previous to this. So police are like, well, we need to speak to you about something. And he's like, well, no, sorry, go to bed. They have to knock down the door. They take him away. They put him into the car. He's reunited with Caleb. He hasn't seen Caleb in a few weeks now. They're taken to the police station. Now, at first, Christopher, he denies that anything has gone on, which is something that he's been told since he was a kid. Deny everything, deny. And this is what Eunice has told him. And eventually, police, they see through it. They know what's gone on. They know. And they say to him, okay, it's fine. We're going to take a little trip to the hospital. So off they go, and they walk through the doors, and Christopher is reunited with Victoria, who he hasn't seen for quite some time now. This is when he realised that Eunice has been lying to him about Victoria, is when Victoria manages to stand up and walk towards him. For the past 4 years, almost 5 years, he's been told that Victoria was paralysed from the waist down. And here she is walking on two feet towards him. He then decides from this, once he deduces that Eunice is a piece of shit and that she's a liar, he decides to help the police with their investigation, and he tells them everything. Again, the coroner has to conduct the bodily examinations because of the historic abuse, and Aloma, she unfortunately has to be examined as well. And even with all of this against her, Eunice still denies everything. However, police, they just charge her. The evidence is too overwhelming. When they conduct an investigation in the house, they find books on Japanese torture, which is what I spoke about earlier, with what the Japanese done to the Chinese, with little notes in Eunice's handwriting in the books. They find the chair leg. They find so much stuff within the squalor and the filth that was their living conditions. Eunice, eventually, she starts taking part in witness intimidation. So at this point, Christopher, he's started a little job and he's trying to move on with his life. And Eunice, she's confronting him outside of his work. She's telling him that she loves him, that they need to move on with this, and he needs to drop the charges. And he's now currently living with a new foster family at this particular point. And he finds information about if he was to get himself into trouble, he will be seen as an unreliable witness and the case would collapse. So he attempts to do this, and he steals his foster family's car, drives around for a bit, but feels a bit guilty about it, so he takes the car back and he fills it up, cleans it, valets it. And the family have contacted the police. When they realise it's Christopher, they very quickly realise what he's up to, and they just say to the police, okay, we don't want to press charges. They say to Christopher, like, obviously we know what you're trying to do and there's no way you're getting out of it. You are going to court. End of. So eventually the trial begins in early 2007. It took around 3 years to get this trial because there was such a torrent of historic abuse that they had to go through. And eventually the judge, he described it as one of the worst cases that he's ever dealt with, if not the worst case. Eunice, she faced 26 charges of child abuse, including unlawful wounding, cruelty to a person under 16, actual bodily harm, perverting the course of justice, and including the witness intimidation. So prosecutor Kerry Barker said that on hearing the indictment, the word that probably sticks in your mind is cruelty. That is what this case is about. It is a history of cruelty by Eunice Spry. She was an adopted mother over a long period of time. The outcome of the interviews was a horrifying catalogue of cruel and sadistic treatments. Most of the acts were carried out by punishment, but others were inexplicable acts of cruelty. So eventually this trial, it lasts for around 4 weeks, and it had a lot of restrictions placed upon it until the sentencing was passed. So no newspaper could report on it. The very little information that was put out, so Christopher, Aloma and Victoria were named as child A, B and C. And Eunice's name wasn't allowed to be mentioned, nothing. And eventually, in April 2007, at Bristol Crown Court, Eunice, she was found guilty on all 26 charges. Judge Simon Darwell Smith saying it was one of the worst cases he's had to deal with. He, however, I could only impose 14 years on her, which was the maximum that could be allowed in England at that particular time. And thanks to the great British legal system, so obviously Eunice, at this point, she's let down. She begins serving her sentence in April 2007. A year and a half later, in September of 2008, thanks to the great British legal system, like I said, Eunice is allowed to have an appeal. She starts this process. She knows that she cannot get out of 25 of her charges. That much is clear. But she manages to argue one of them. On what grounds, I'm not 100% sure on. I'm going to find a lot of information. But on one of her charges, she manages to argue against it. Unsettlingly and very weirdly, the Court of Human Being Rights, they agree with her, and her sentence is eventually reduced to 12 years. Eunice, she was eventually released in 2014, so she ends up only serving 7 years of her 12-year sentence. Because of the nature of her crime, she's given a new identity, and this basically means that she's allowed to serve with the Jehovah's Witnesses once more. Now, what they would argue is Eunice was the name that was disfellowshipped. She is no longer welcome, which is true. That they would completely shun Eunice Spry. They would not allow her within the doors. But this new woman that's come here, her name is not Eunice Spry. Her name is unknown. Insert any name here. This is Cheryl. This is Madeline, for example. And this is what they would argue, because Eunice was the one that was convicted. This is not Eunice Spry, so she's allowed to serve with us. And unfortunately, or fortunately, however way you want to look at it, her identity has been compromised quite a numerous amount of times over the past intervening years. Because Eunice, stupidly, she has gone back to her old roots. This meant she was within a 20-mile distance of all of her victims, so Aloma, Christopher and Victoria. In fact, during a podcast with Liam Tuff not that long ago, I believe only in the past couple of months, this podcast came out. Christopher said that he actually had quite close contact with Eunice. He was at a petrol garage where he lives, and Eunice come walking out, and they just looked at each other. Obviously, they're not meant to be anywhere near each other. But because Eunice had such a recognisable evil face, people were spotting her all over, and they were taking photos of her and sending it to Christopher. And this naturally meant that Christopher had to call the police and say, by the way, Eunice has been spotted. They would have to go out, talk to her, and give her a new identity. It never pays off to do that, guys. If you do recognise someone that's been in the papers for a heinous crime like this, it is really not worth you putting the picture out onto social media or sending it out to anyone, because you're the one that's going to end up in trouble. Most famous case of this was Tina Malone, the actress who played Mimi in Shameless. So she shared a picture of what she believed to be John Venables, who of course was one of the boys who killed James Bulger. Now she, obviously him and Robert, they both have a lifelong anonymity. And Tina shared a picture of what she believed was John. It could have possibly have been him. But she shared this picture on her social media, and this has resulted in her being arrested and fined. So honestly, it really isn't worth it, guys. I know that we want to see justice, because what kind of justice is that for the victims? But unfortunately, these are the laws that are in place. It's nothing that we can do about. It really isn't worth the £10,000 fine or the possible prison sentence for some piece of shit like Eunice, Spry, like John Venables. So my advice is just don't do it. So Christopher, to close on a really positive note, he has managed to lead a real successful career in what he's been doing. He's since married. He's now got a little boy, but he still feels the after effects of what's happened to him. So obviously I follow Christopher on Instagram, and quite a lot of his time in 2019 was spent in hospital, and that was just various different treatments. He said that he's gone for dental records and dental appointments. He was getting abscesses in his mouth, and during operations they found splintered wood, they found tips and knives embedded in his mouth, in his throat, his scarring in his stomach because of are instances where Eunice would force her children to retain washing up liquid in their mouths, or she would force them to drink TCP, and it's burnt the line of their stomach, so his stomach is scarred. He said that he's got a cobweb of broken bones all throughout his body. But despite everything that he's gone through, he's remained a real positive outlook on life, and he's made something of his life. He wrote about his account in his book called Child Sea, and he said that he's in the process of possibly releasing a second book just to finally end the chapter on his life. That is Eunice Spry. So Aloma, she maintained a relationship, she went on to have children. She too wrote a book called Deliver Me From Evil. She didn't really speak about much afterwards. She just wanted to live her life, and she did so. She was happy, she was a mum. Sadly, I don't know what from, but sadly Aloma passed away only this year, in the end of July, I believe it was. I'm not 100% sure what from, not that it's any of my business, but I really hope it was nothing really, really serious. I hope she went in a peaceful way, what I'm saying. Finally got some peace in her life. I don't know if that's the right phrasing. It's sad that she died. You know, she was a warrior, but you know, I was kind of sad reading about it. It's only quite recently when I was doing the research for this case, I found out that she had passed away. So Victoria, she too released a book called Tortured. Now, unlike Christopher and Aloma, who obviously they've probably battled their own demons resulting in this, Victoria was deeply affected due to the abuse she suffered. She wasn't able to fully recover from it. She struggled in her daily life. She managed to maintain a relationship. She went on to own 2 dogs. But she was always fearful about Eunice. And she was just constantly in fear. She spoke out during a BBC interview about how she would go to job interviews and would ask her why she has no experience, what she's been doing for the past God knows how long, and no one believed her story. And she ended up in the beginning of 2020 signing into a mental health facility. And around this time as well, she managed to reconnect with her biological family. She meets her younger brother Daniel, and he said that he visited her in the facility. They tried to hold on to some sort of relationship, but sadly in September of 2020, whilst the world was in the grips of the pandemic, which put on hold a lot of resources for people like Victoria, Victoria ended up taking her own life. She hung herself and was found by her partner. It really does put in perspective, you know, how abuse can take over your life in such a way. Yeah. Around 2015, 2020, a lot of stories about the Jehovah's Witness community started coming out, like I said, about the cover-ups of abuse. 2020 was the year that quite a lot of people within the community actually left the community. And what it was is it's the reason that we don't really see door-to-door knocking anymore. Because obviously it got stopped during the pandemic. You know, people weren't allowed to leave their homes, and with them being at home, it eventually allowed some free thinking to creep in, and a lot of people after the pandemic, they just never went back to the faith. They never bothered going back. They decided they were much happier. And this is from various ex-Jehovah's Witness YouTubers that I've been watching for the past few months. XJW Panda, well, Red Panda, he's one of them. He's spoken about his experiences growing up within the faith. It's one that I highly recommend. If you are curious about it, that's one that I recommend. This also meant quite a lot of the Kingdom Halls ended up being sold off, and the organisation is mainly an online one. There are still Kingdom Halls about. There's one not that far from where I live at the moment. I see it all the time when I'm going past on the bus. They are still about. You can read them up on their website, but it's a very dwindling community now because, like I said, a lot of people never went back after the pandemic. I just want to thank all of you guys for watching. Turned into almost an hour and a half of rambling on. I'm really sorry about that. I just got so much information from this case, a lot more than what I thought I would. I appreciate each and every one of you guys for coming, for tuning in. I am sorry to ramble on so much, but I just wanted to put out a fresh perspective on this case and hopefully give you some information on a very damaging, in my opinion, from what I've heard, a very damaging organisation. I really appreciate each and every one of you for coming. I will see you very soon for the next true crime story with Silhouette. So like I said, I am dropping down to fortnightly videos, and that way I can just focus on giving you much better content, hopefully like I did today. So please guys, stay safe, and I'll see you very, very soon. Take care.